There are a number of things in the Bronze Age of comics that mark it as separate from the Silver Age, but probably the primary fact is the comic book artists and authors changing their perceptions of how to deal with the comics code and its restrictions on the stories they can tell. One of the things they wanted to do was um, make relevant comics about issues of the day, including drug abuse and drug addiction. However, the Comics Code did not allow any depictions of drug use in their comics, whether depicting them as being good or bad. So Stan Lee decided that he would not submit his Spider-Man comic, a 3-issue comic that dealt with drug use on the streets of New York City, and he decided not to submit those issues to the Comics Code. If you look at this cover of Amazing Spider-Man, number 96, you'll see there's no Comics Code Authority stamp on it. The comic still was published and distributed through the local retailers, and it sold quite well, even without the stamp. This caused the Comics Code Authority to reevaluate what they thought about comics. Part of that 3-issue run of Spider-Man was a depiction of someone high on drugs and Spider-Man having to save them. Even though this was a depiction of drugs in a very negative light and Spider-Man saving the day, the Comics Code Authority still denied them. However, in light of the actions that Stan Lee and Marvel Comics took, they had to revise their code. And so depictions of drug use could be put into the books as long as they were in a negative light. And with that, DC decided to make their own anti-drug comics with their very famous editions of Green Lantern and Green Arrow, where they teamed up to fight drugs on American streets. Another thing that made the Bronze Age of comics different from the Silver Age is the darkness of the stories, including these gritty stories of drug use, but in other ways as well. Here in this issue of Spider-Man, the famous one called The Night Gwen Stacy Died, was the kill-off of a major character, which you never would have seen in the Silver Age. And this kind of gritty, realistic comic was very indicative of the Bronze Age of comics. There's also greater representation in comics, such as the Black Panther, who was one of the first black superheroes to be featured in comics. While he's technically started in the Silver Age, he did become much more popular and really thrived in the Bronze Age of comics. However, other African American heroes also rose up as well, including Storm from the X-Men, Luke Cage, Black Lightning, and others. Another key issue from the Bronze Age is Giant Size X-Men. It was when they decided to revamp their X-Men series and add all new characters, including the addition of Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, and Wolverine. One key feature of this was how multicultural it is. You had Storm from Africa, you had Wolverine from Canada, you had Colossus, who was Russian, and Nightcrawler was from Eastern Europe. And they had Native American characters and Asian characters, and they were all kind of built in, and really started kind of a multicultural movement in comics. Frank Miller was another popular artist. His dark, gritty, realistic comics became very popular as he started his run in Daredevil, and continued it in one of the most popular series is The Dark Knight Returns. This is where Batman is old and grizzled and really becomes an anti-hero. And anti-heroes are kind of the theme of the Bronze Age, where heroes result to doing things that seem maybe slightly less heroic, but in the name of good and saving the day. Sometimes they would resort to killing the villains, which they never would have before, and they become much darker and more violent heroes, including heroes like Wolverine, including heroes like the Punisher, all became popular during this time. Alan Moore's The Watchmen was kind of the pinnacle of the Bronze Age, where all the heroes in this kind of hero group are basically anti-heroes. None of them are really, really good people, but they are still heroes in their own world. It's a very interesting look at a realistic version of what real heroes might be if they were in the real world. And so that concludes our discussion of the Bronze Age of comics. And let's look at some notes. So our Bronze Age notes include: the Bronze Age is noted by authors and artists pushing the limits of the Comics Code Authority. Specifically, a push by authors including Stan Lee, who wanted to shed light on the horrors of drug addiction and drug abuse. Stan Lee published issues of Spider-Man without submitting them to the Comics Code. This caused the Comics Code Authority to be pressured to change its rules, and it did. The Bronze Age also saw the rise of the dark hero and anti-hero, including Wolverine, Punisher, and Watchmen. The face of heroes became more diverse, with Black Panther, Storm, Black Lightning, and others. And many stories during this age took a darker turn, with the deaths of major characters like Gwen Stacy in Spider-Man, and Barry Allen, The Flash, and heroes taking more drastic and violent measures. That concludes our discussion on the Bronze Age of comics. In our next study, we will learn about the modern age of comics, leading up from the Bronze Age.